All right, so we're going to continue our tour now through the different tissues of the body. So we had gone through the covering and lining tissue. So remember what that one is? Covering and lining starts with an E. Epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is our covering and lining. So remember that we learned all the specific subcategories. Two-name system. First name has to do with the number of layers. Second name has to do with the cell shape. Put those together, you have your different types. So make sure that you know the specific types, their function, and where you can find them in the body. Okay, so 3 additional types of tissue to go: connective, muscle, and nervous. So connective tissue we find all over the place. So we even saw connective tissue underlying our epithelial tissues. So we can find it associated with other tissues, holding other tissues together. So binding and support, protecting, insulating. So we'll talk about that. Oddly enough, there are some connective tissues where it's straightforward, where you're like, yep, bone, got it, connective tissue. But then others, you're like, fat. Somehow fat or adipose tissue is connective tissue. Blood, blood, connective tissue. So when you look at those, then it takes a little bit more of a stretch in terms of figuring out how they actually belong within this category. But we will sort that out. Okay, so 4 main classes of connective tissue. We've got connective tissue proper, we've got cartilage, we've got bone, and blood. So connective tissue proper is where we will start, but regardless of those 4 where they seem really diverse, we'll find that they do have characteristics that they share that put them in the connective tissue category. So 3 main characteristics that we see. Number 1, they all have a common embryonic origin. So they all come from what's called mesenchymal tissue or mesenchymal cells, and then they develop into different types of connective tissue. So if we trace them back to development, like the cell line, we can see they all come from the same type of precursor cell. Secondly, though, different degrees of vascularity. So these are all vascularized in terms of, well, let me back up from that. They have different degrees of vascularity, even going to 0 degrees. Now, when we talk about cartilage being avascular, to be sure, kind of like epithelial tissue, there are blood vessels right close to it. So it's not like it's totally cut off, but there are just no blood vessels actually going into it itself. And that certainly can lead to issues in terms of cartilage not being able to repair itself very well because it doesn't have that direct access to oxygen and nutrients, etc. Meanwhile, we go to other tissue types, right? Bone is very highly vascularized. When we get to we have blood. So to a certain extent, that's inside of blood vessels. So differing degrees of vascularity, not all avascular like we saw before in terms of the epithelial tissue. And what we find here is that connective tissue, we have these cells. Cells do look kind of different based on their function, but they're surrounded by an extracellular matrix. And so when we look at this extracellular matrix, it can be different in terms of whether it is solid or fluid or gelatinous. But when you picture, or when you actually see, and you will, our connective tissues, you will find that we have a bunch of different cells, and then we see all of this extracellular matrix in between. So it's not like epithelial tissue where it's all stacked together and attached to one another and very little extracellular matrix. It's kind of the opposite. So matrix is going to support those cells in various types of ways. For connective tissues, especially the harder ones, the more stable ones, it's going to be more gelatinous, it's going to be harder, but it's going to support the cells physically. Okay. So when we look at connective tissues as well, they have 3 main elements to them. They have what's called ground substance, fibers, and then the cells themselves. And so when we look at those first 2 are what make up the extracellular matrix. And depending on how strong it needs to be, how flexible it needs to be, etc., the number of fibers, the diameter of the fibers, and things like that are going to be different. Same thing with the ground substance also. So it depends on whether it's going to be mineralized, whether it's going to be fluid, etc. So the composition of these elements is what makes our different types of connective tissues. So when we look at those fibers, like we said, fibers, as you can imagine, kind of like if you're talking about like adobe and you have the clay itself and then you have the straw going throughout it, or you're talking about concrete and they put rebar in it, the fibers give it support, and there's different types of fibers. There's collagen fibers, which is the strongest, so they're biggest and they're strongest and most abundant. There are also elastic fibers, which, as the name indicates, they're going to be a bit more flexible. And so the elastic fibers have elastin inside of them that allow more bending and stretching. And then lastly, there are what are called reticular fibers. So these are the smallest of them, and these ones are kind of branched instead. And so the branching actually gives them more give as opposed to one collagen fiber going this way or all aligned this way and giving us a lot of strength, etc. But usually the different types of connective tissue will have a combination of these different fiber types, and it's just a question of, do we need more collagen fibers because we need it to be stronger? Do we need more elastic fibers and reticular because we need it more flexible and giving, etc.? All right, so let's look at the cells. So with the cells that we have for our connective tissue, we tend to have different categories of cells. We have blast cells, which don't explode. That's the suffix for these ones. So the blast cells are the immature cells that actively secrete the extracellular matrix. So for instance, we have fibroblasts, which are found in connective tissue proper. We have chondroblasts, which are in cartilage. You see they end in blast. And we have osteoblasts, which are found in bone. We also have some stem cells that are found in bones as well. But these are all the very early cells. And you know, when you're younger, you got a lot of energy, you do a lot of things, etc. Same thing in terms of these cells. They're building, constantly building, especially during development, but also during your lifetime, they're building more of that particular tissue in the extracellular matrix. Okay, then we have the mature cells, right? After the prime, you get to the mature cells. These are going to be sites. So these are the mature cells that now become part of the tissue, and while they may maintain the extracellular matrix, they're not actively making it like we see with the blast cells. So osteocytes, chondrocytes, etc. And then we also have different types of cells that we see that are cells that we find in other types of connective tissues, because we do have some diversity of the connective tissues. So for instance, we have fat cells in adipose tissue that store nutrients. In blood, we have white blood cells and red blood cells. We have those that are defending us, the white. We have the red, which are carrying oxygen. Mast cells, which are part of our immune system. And then macrophages. And again, when we look at that, right, macro is going to be big, and phage or phago means eat, right? So they're often part of the immune system as well, going around and eating up old cells or pathogens, disease-causing agents, etc. So if you were to zoom down into connective tissue, again, you're going to see individual cells, sometimes of different cell types. You're going to see fibers cutting through it, again, of different types, and you're going to see this extracellular matrix, this ground substance, this filler as well. So again, you can see collagen fibers are going to be much bigger diameter, stronger ones, elastic fibers, and then the reticular fibers are going to be the smallest ones that we see there. Okay, so when we get to the connective tissues, like we said, 4 main classes, right? Connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. And we'll explain each of those along the way. Now when we get to, like, this is kind of like our progression through all the tissues. Connective tissue proper has the most kind of subcategories, then cartilage has just a few, then when we get to bone and blood, fewer still. In fact, blood is just blood. Okay, so connective tissue proper is going to be basically, like you saw on the list, everything except for those last 3. And we have 2 subclasses. We call connective tissue proper itself the loose ones. So you would imagine that is describing the arrangement. So arrangement of fibers and things like that. So there is a subcategory of connective tissue proper, the loose ones, loose connective tissue, areolar, adipose, reticular, and then we get to the connective tissue proper, dense connective tissues. So as you can imagine, the dense ones, rather than fibers going willy-nilly every once in a while, these are going to be densely packed with fibers. So these are tending to be stronger types of connective tissue proper. So dense regular, dense irregular, and then elastic. So again, we're going to look at the fibers that are in there, the arrangement of them, and that'll help us to show, does this need to be a connective tissue that needs to be flexible? Does it need to be very strong? Does it need to be, again, hard or stiff or gelatinous or fluid, etc.? So we're looking at all the different components, the cells, the fibers, and that extracellular matrix. Okay, so we start out with some of our loose connective tissues. So this is the areolar connective tissue. And the areolar connective tissue, remember when we were talking about the covering and lining, and we said that underneath the covering and lining we have connective tissue kind of holding it on down here, like towards the basement membrane, right? So that lamina propria that we see there, that is made up of connective tissue, specifically areolar connective tissue. So you can see different fiber types in there, right? So you can see the bigger collagen fibers. You can also see the elastic fibers, which kind of look like little black lines, like pencil lines, etc. So to a certain extent, this works to kind of hold, loosely hold things together. Capillaries, delicate capillaries underneath mucous membranes and things like that. So that's areolar. It's not areolar, it's called areolar. Okay, then we have adipose. So this is basically fat. Now when you're looking at this, you're like, I don't get it, right? This is one of the ones where connective tissue, how does it connect? Well, support and protect, to be sure, right? Adipose tissue, now we're showing it here in the breast, right? But you have adipose tissue as a cushion, right? So you have subcutaneous adipose tissue underneath your skin. Your kidneys have a capsule that's made up of adipose tissue because they're only partially covered by the ribs, and so we need some extra cushion there, like, you know, bubble wrap or whatever, and it kind of looks like bubble wrap. And so that, at least, we get the protective function of it, right? So that makes it a connective tissue. And then in terms of extracellular matrix, this is one of the connective tissues where there's not as much extracellular matrix. It's mainly a lot of these cells. So this is an adipocyte, this whole thing right here. And it's basically there for storing fat, for cushion, for insulation, etc., and energy storage. And so its main role is this whole cell holds fat. This is a big fat droplet in a kind of like an vacuole inside of it, if you will. And it takes up almost the entire volume of the cell. Here's the nucleus of the cell, pushed way to the side right here. So this is a type of loose connective tissue. It's adipose. Then we have reticular. Now reticular is a little bit stronger. We see a lot of different cells in there. Now we have reticular fibers, right? So reticular fibers, when we look at it, we're going to see more fibers. We have more of a gel-like extracellular matrix or ground substance. And again, this helps to form a flexible kind of structure surrounding particular cells or organs, etc. So for instance, in some of our lymphatic system, which is like our immune system, like when we look at the spleen, this is a way where we can kind of help to organize some of the cells of the spleen and give it structure without a whole like hard bony surrounding or something like that, or some of our rougher types of connective tissues. This is more of like a loose network of reticular fibers, so we call it reticular loose connective tissue or reticular connective tissue. Okay, then we get to the dense connective tissues. So the dense connective tissues have a lot of fibers, dense, right? Really dense, packed in there. And then the question is, what fibers are in there and how are they arranged? So for instance, here is dense regular connective tissue. And all the things you see here, these are all collagen fibers, right? So we see collagen fibers in here that are basically parallel. We have some elastic fibers, but mainly we have collagen fibers that are all in parallel. It gives it a lot of strength. So different ligaments and tendons and things like that are made up of dense regular connective tissue. This one's stained pink. It's usually kind of a white color. But all of those collagen fibers regularly arranged, dense regular connective tissue. This is dense irregular. A lot of fibers, but it looks like somebody stuck a spoon in there and kind of mixed it all up, right? So it has some strength, but it has a little bit more flexibility, like you see here, the joint capsule in the shoulder joint, where we have to have a lot of movement. Also, when we get to the skin and we talk about the epidermis, which is epithelium, and then the dermis, which is underneath the epithelium, the dermis, where the blood vessels are and a lot of the receptors and things like that as well, that is where we have dense irregular connective tissue. A little bit stronger, but not like a strap like we see like with the dense regular connective tissue of tendons and ligaments. Then we have elastic. Now elastic, you would imagine, needs to have a lot of flexibility to it. And that's what we see, is we see a lot of wiggly little black elastic fibers through it, right? And so densely packed, but with elastic fibers, gives it more flexibility. So when we see it in large blood vessels, so large blood vessels that are receiving these big tidal waves of blood coming from the heart, they have to be able to stretch and then go through this elastic recoil and stretch and do this elastic recoil. And so we have to have a lot of elastic connective tissue in there. So that's very good for their flexibility, just like in the vertebral column and even in the bronchial tubes along the respiratory system. So those are 3 types of dense connective tissue. We have dense regular, dense irregular, and then elastic dense connective tissue. So now we move to cartilage. Now cartilage, we go from things like fibroblasts to chondro. Chondro means cartilage. So chondroblasts, which are making it, chondrocytes, the mature cells that are existing within it. So they sit, those chondrocytes, those mature cells, sit within little homes. And it's kind of like with bone cells as well. You can imagine this really active cell, maybe like a little kid, like a chondroblast, that wants to build. And so he's got these blocks and he's building, and he keeps building and he keeps building and he keeps building all the way around him, very excited. And all of a sudden, as he's been building, now he gets all the way around him, he's like, darn it, now I've walled myself in. What am I going to do? That's a bit like how a chondroblast turns into a chondrocyte. Once they've totally surrounded themselves with extracellular matrix, now they've reached the more mature stage where they just kind of maintain themselves in this little hole that they've created that's called a lacuna. And then plural is lacunae, like you see with the AE on the end. Okay, so when we look at cartilage, we have a lot of gelatin in there in the extracellular matrix, a lot of water in there, and then collagen fibers as well as different types of proteins. Perhaps you recognize these proteins here, chondroitin and hyaluronic acid. So when people are talking about cartilage degeneration, they talk about taking like chondroitin sulfate and things like that to try to give their body what it needs to then bolster the cartilage. Whether it works or not, hard to say. You usually have to take it in large amounts and over long periods of time. Okay, so cartilage, tough but flexible. So it's going to be a cushion. We need, like at the ends of bones, we want to make sure that the bones, when they form a joint, they're not grinding on each other. So we put cushion on the end so that they've got some stiffness but also some kind of resilience to it so that they're not grinding on each other. So cartilage, like we said, is avascular, but it has blood vessels near it in a surrounding membrane that's called the perichondrium. And it's underneath that perichondrium where we have our chondroblasts, and then finally chondroblasts that give rise to our chondrocytes. Now, we saw 3 different types of connective tissue proper in terms of dense, right? We had loose before, then we had dense, different subcategories. Now we're in cartilage, 3 types of cartilage. Again, we look at how densely packed is it with fibers and what type of fibers are in it based on the strength and the flexibility that it needs. So we have hyaline cartilage, which is the most abundant part. This is kind of like the grizzle, like if you're chewing on chicken bone or something like that, and right, the grizzle that you hear about, or if you even, you may have a steak and it's got some, besides the fat, right, it's got some, may have some cartilage associated with it, with joints. And it tends to be pretty slippery, but also really flexible. So we find it on the ends of bones, like I said, in the nose where it needs structure, but we need flexibility, the trachea, the larynx, even the cartilage of the ribs as well. So hyaline cartilage, that's the first one. Then we have elastic cartilage. So you can imagine inside of elastic cartilage, we're going to have more elastic fibers, right? So it's going to be more flexible. So we find that in the ears, right? A little bit more flexibility like we see down here, and the epiglottis, which is a little trap door that covers the trachea when you swallow, sending the food and drink down the esophagus as opposed to down the trachea. Lastly, third type is fibrocartilage. And again, here, look at that prefix. So that basically is giving us some more fibers, which means more strength. So it's kind of like between hyaline cartilage and dense regular tissue. It's very strong, and so it tends to be in places where we have a lot of weight or something like that and compression, so like in the intervertebral disc between the vertebrae of the back and in the knee. So here's some pictures of it, right? Hyaline cartilage. This is the lacuna. This is the hole. And the cell takes up the whole hole. Remember when you're looking at cells in the microscope? That little black dot, that's the nucleus. The cell is going to be out here. So the chondrocyte almost takes up the entire lacuna, and then we have all this pink gelatinous matrix out here. There are collagen fibers out here, but you can't usually see them. Meanwhile, if we look at elastic cartilage, now we can see those elastic fibers crisscrossing through the extracellular matrix. Still have chondrocytes, etc., because it's cartilage, but more elastic fibers. And of course, fibrocartilage, even more fibers, like we see here. Collagen fibers for strength. Okay, then we get to bone. This is also called osseous tissue. It's ossified, it's hardened, etc. So not only does it support and protect, etc., but it works with the muscles. So the muscles connect to the bones so we can move the body itself. But also some interesting functions you wouldn't normally think of. Stores fat in terms of yellow bone marrow and synthesizes blood cells, both red and white blood cells, as well as platelets. So has more of these what are called inorganic calcium salts to it, so that the ground substance, the extracellular matrix, is hard, and has more collagen as well, so more strength. And now we go from chondro with cartilage to osteo for bone. So osteoblasts and osteocytes sitting in their own little lacunae. So there's actually a couple different types of bone that we'll learn as we get towards the skeletal system. There's compact bone, and then there's spongy bone, but it's all calcified matrix with our osteocytes on the inside of it. Now, this is a close view of what's called compact bone. It occurs like right here, as well as here, right? It's along the edges of the bone. It's kind of like with an M&M, you have the hard candy outside, right? Same thing here. So you're kind of looking down the barrel of it. You're looking at these organizational units that are called osteons. This is where the blood vessels are. It's well vascularized. But these little spider-like things here, those are the osteocytes. So they look not much more than a little smear, but those are the osteocytes, and these black little spider-like cells. So bone definitely is living tissue and connective tissue. And then finally, blood. So blood, you're like, I don't get it, doesn't protect. Does protect though. White blood cells like you see there protect you against pathogens, etc. And if we look at it, right, what's the definition of a connective tissue? When we look at its organization, a bunch of cells surrounded by extracellular matrix. In this case, fluid extracellular matrix, which is going to be the plasma. So in that way, it certainly anatomically fits, and in terms of connecting as a function, it fits too, right? It physiologically connects and distributes all nutrients and waste products and respiratory gases all around the body. Okay, so that's connective tissue. Like I said, a little bit fewer, maybe, than epithelial. We're going to get simpler still. Muscle and nervous, don't worry. Not many at all. Only 3 muscle types, only 1 nervous tissue type. So muscle tissue, big job, just to move. That's all. Just moves. Contracts and it changes shape, and then when you stop stimulating it, it relaxes. Very, very vascularized, so it uses a lot of energy. We need to deliver nutrients to it, etc. And it has those myofilaments, those contractile filaments inside of it. We'll talk more about those actin and myosin filaments when we get to that chapter. So 3 types of muscle tissue only: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. So skeletal muscle is the one that you're going to be most familiar with. These are the muscles that move the skeleton. That's where it gets its name. Now these are some of the largest cells in the body, some of the largest muscle cells for sure. They're oftentimes the whole length of the muscle. So these are one of our examples of multinucleate cells. So when we're looking at them here in the microscope, this is one cell like we see right here, but this cell goes way over here and way off the screen over there as well. Okay? So skeletal muscle moves the skeleton, is voluntary, right? You think about it and it happens. You voluntarily control it. It's multinucleate, and see how it has these stripes to it? These are called striations. It has to do with the organization of those myofilaments. Cardiac muscle tissue is a little bit like skeletal muscle tissue in that it has striations. They're harder to see, but again, little stripes to it. But these are branching cells instead. So, you know, it may branch like over to here and connect to here and go over to here like this. And so there's a lot more connectivity to our cardiac muscle cells. But that's helpful because they all work together. Individual skeletal muscle cells can constrict and then relax, but we want the heart to be working all together. Atria, ventricles, all the cells lining those chambers, we want to contract at the same time. So they have these special cell-to-cell connections called intercalated discs, where we have gap junctions, which again allow ions to flow directly from one cell to another. So these are considered involuntary cells. You don't have to think about your heart beating, but technically you can modify it, right? If you chant your mantra or think of something like the first test, then that will actually change the rhythm. But normally they operate on an involuntary level, and they're only found in the heart, hence the name cardiac muscle. Lastly, smooth muscle gets its name from the fact that it does not have stripes or striations. These are pennate-shaped cells. They taper towards the end, kind of like that. Like cardiac muscle cells, uninucleate. Only one cell, one nucleus. And these ones are definitely involuntary. So you find them in places like the iris of the eye, constrict and dilate. You find them along the digestive tract. You find them in the erector pili muscles to make your hair stand up. And so they're going to contract as well. Sometimes they help with movement of hairs or food or changing the amount of light that it's going in your eye. So, 3 types of muscle. Easy, see? Lastly, nervous tissue. So remember, nervous system, communicate, control like a puppet master, and these are the cells that tend to make it up mainly. So the nerve cells have a specialized name that are called neurons. And so you would imagine, right, if they're going to be a puppet master, right, with lots of different connections to control different parts, etc., if we look at those cells, they are also going to have a unique shape like that. So in the microscope, you may not be able to tell, at least in this one. This was a better example, this one here. This is one cell here. So see, that's part of it. This is part of it here. This is another part of it here. And then this is another part of it. So there are these star-shaped cells that have lots of different branches to connect to other cells in order to communicate and control. So neurons basically transmit electrical signals. Muscle cells contract, they're excitable. These ones, when you stimulate them, they receive the communication and then they relay the message on. So obviously found in brain, spinal cord, and different nerves around the body. All right, very last thing in terms of our tour, when we're talking about these different tissues and things like that, you know, when we introduced the body and we talked about the different cavities that the organs sit within, thing like that, we did mention membranes. And we've mentioned a little bit in terms of membranes in here too. Cutaneous membrane is the skin, so we talked about the skin. Mucous membranes with the goblet cells secreting mucus along our epithelial linings for organs that open to the outside. And even serous membranes that are on the surface of organs as they squish and they don't generate friction, right? So when we look at them, we talk about membranes here, and we'll use examples of them further down the way as necessary. But these membranes also tend to be made up of epithelium, covering and lining, and then they'll usually have connective tissue underlying them. So cutaneous, skin, mucous membranes, serous membranes. So generally, there can be wet or dry, thick or thin, but they're all coverings and linings, right? So cutaneous is the skin. Integumentary system, different names for the same thing. So that's your plasma membrane, if you will. This is a dry membrane. Mucous membranes, like we said, lining different organs that open to the outside. And then serous membranes lining the outsides of organs and lining the cavities to make sure that they, when they're moving, they're slipping past each other rather than generating friction. So just a reminder, as we were talking about coverings and linings and things like that, we have to know about different types of membranes. Lastly, we talk a little bit about tissue repair. So it depends on the type of tissue as to how well it can repair, like we were talking about. In terms of cartilage, not very good. Nervous system, depends. Central nervous system, not very good. Peripheral nervous system, a bit better. Bone, really good. Muscle, really good. Epithelial tissue, generally very good. So if you have damage, generally you're going to have inflammation at the site because we are opening up the blood vessels and trying to get nutrients and get our different protective structures to that site of damage. And so what you usually have, if you have damage is hopefully you're going to have total repair of it. So you'll have regeneration where the same tissue, like epithelial tissue, fills it in. But if somehow the cut is too big or the damage is too extensive and we can't knit it back together and fill it in, then we may quickly instead layer it with connective tissue instead. And that's where you tend to get scars. Scars, let's see. And there's a little bit of a scar there. Every scar has a story that goes with it, but if it's big, if it gets infected, if something goes wrong with this reparation, right, with this regeneration, then we're going to have fibrosis. We're going to layer in connective tissue there. And connective tissue, it's avascular in terms of connective tissue fibers, so it appears whitish rather than the regular color, but it does the job. So usually if we're doing a repair, again, like we said, we have inflammation, we have more flow that's going to go to the site of damage to get rid of things as well as bring in substances that can help with the repairs. We're going to organize, right? We start layering it in, we start filling in, we're stimulating these cells next to it to start going through mitosis and filling it in. Fibroblasts are making more fibers, macrophages are eating and getting rid of any infection, getting rid of damaged cells. And then connective tissue is going to continue to fill in, but hopefully as well, you're going to get some of that overlying structure to fill in as well. So usually we're going to get both types of tissues in there. We're going to get connective tissue that helps to fill in. Hopefully it doesn't have to totally fill it in, and we're going to get then the original tissue hopefully filling in that space too, so that our tissue becomes functional again. So like we said, the regenerative capacity between these different tissue types is quite different. We see up here ones that do it quite well. We go down here, right, smooth muscle and dense regular like ligaments and stuff like that, not quite as good. And these ones, cardiac muscle, nervous tissue, etc., not quite so good. But they are learning more and more about different kind of populations of cells that they didn't really know existed before that can help to regenerate functional tissue, as well as being able to stimulate these cells to go into a mitotic phase where they've gone into more of the interphase and stayed there for longer periods of time. Okay, well that takes us to the end of this chapter on tissues. So, chemical level, cellular level, tissue level. Next we move into organs and organ systems. To a certain extent, that's kind of where you thought this class was going to be. You're talking about the different organ systems of the body and how they preserve life, but we had to get you up to that point first because we understand that these organizational levels that we've been discussing are all physically and functionally making up the levels that we're going to learn about in the future.